All right, so we can give it few minutes, a couple minutes for people to join, and then we can go ahead and get started. Are there any particular questions for us, for the Chameleon staff from the attendees, or anything that we should focus on in particular in the webinar today? You're more than welcome to drop any ideas you have in the question interface. Um, and if you have any questions throughout the presentation, you're more than welcome to use the raise hand function. Should show up at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you raise your hands, someone can unmute you, and then you'll be able to talk and ask your question live. You can also ask a question through the Q&A. This is just a text-based Q&A, so you can type a question there, and then it will show up and we'll be able to answer it as we go. But this tutorial is going to assume basically that you are new to Chameleon, so we're going to be going through, all of the basics of how to get set up on the platform and such. If you have more advanced questions, it's probably best to save those for the end, or you can always reach out to me or Mark Powers, my colleague who's on the call today, and we're happy to answer any questions for you regarding the use of the system. So I'm going to get started with the slides here. Probably spend a little bit of time on the slides and then kind of move over to more of a demonstration of the system and how you can reserve hardware and use it. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the actual slides. So Chameleon is an edge to cloud testbed. This is basically we like to talk a lot about our bare metal reconfiguration, the isolation that we provide for a lot of our nodes. So this can be really nice for doing experimentation. If you don't need bare metal, we also have virtual instances that you can launch through the KVM cloud that we have. And we also have containers that you can deploy on edge devices. This is through our Chia Edge platform. And, with all these options and reconfiguration available, basically you get the ability to do all types of things on Chameleon, from power things, power your node on and off, reboot it, customize the kernel. So this flexibility reconfiguration gives a lot of latitude for type of research you want to do, what kind of research, what data you're interested in collecting for the research. So there's a lot to explore. We, of course, provide this from, large scale. So we have some resources, CPUs, some GPU nodes where we have, dozens of different nodes available that you can use. Other cases, we may have more specialized hardware in smaller quantities. So things like, bare metal H100 node. We do have that, but we only have two of them. So we try to provide kind of a breadth of resources for everyone, as well as provide some scale for people who are doing things like, multi-node clusters or other things that might require more than just one node or even dozens of nodes. We are based on the open source OpenStack cloud services. So a lot of the stuff that you see on Chameleon may be familiar if you've ever worked with OpenStack. Of course, we have expanded and built upon OpenStack quite a bit to meet the requirements of our specific research communities. But a good part of what we're doing is open source and can be reused for, various purposes. And then a big part of why we're here today is, we provide a lot of services for digital artifact sharing. This includes things like integration with Jupyter. We have a Trovy service that is a repository for sharing testbed artifacts. There's also a day pass function that allows you to give access to your artifact, allow people to actually run it on the system without having any Chameleon account themselves or without having an active allocation on the system. So it can be a really nice way to package your artifacts, package your experiments, and then also share them with other people to collaborate on or for them to reuse or reproduce in their own way. And this is a little bit out of date, but just showing some highlights. We've had, or actually over 1,200 papers have been published from work on the Chameleon system, including many papers in supercomputing. We've served actually closer to 1,300 unique projects now, and our users are getting close to about 14,000 since project inception. This slide is just kind of showing a quick overview of the Chameleon system. We have different Chameleon sites, so Chiat UC and Chiat TAC are going to be our main biggest sites. We also recently added a site at Chiat NCAR. This has, I believe, about 40 CPU nodes that is available there now. So lots of capacity on this new Chiat NCAR site. We have some volunteer sites that also provide their own hardware, but they're set up through our Chi in a Box packaging. So they, basically it shows up as a Chameleon site as our other main sites. And then we have our Chi@Edge platform, which is where we have all of our edge resources if you need to use those. So we'll go into a little bit more about how you can find all this hardware later, but that just gives you a quick overview. And then finally, what I'll be kind of going through mostly today, which is this experiment workflow on Chameleon. So we'll talk a little bit about how you can discover resources, how you can allocate those resources so that you have access to them, and then how you can configure your environments in various ways to actually run experiments on the resources. We provide this experimental workflow through kind of three different interfaces. So these are mentioned down here on the slide. We have a graphical user interface, which of course is, just point and click, go to the website. You can configure leases, reservations, launch instances, basically pretty much, everything you could want to do with Chameleon, you can do it through the graphical user interface. However, if you're a little bit more advanced or you like to use programmatic interfaces, we also have a command line interface. This is mostly through the OpenStack command line tool. And then we also have a Python library called Python Chi, and this is particularly useful when you're working with Jupyter notebooks or things like that, because you can create scripts that use Python Chi to actually make your reservations for particular resources, launch your servers, configure them the way you want, and then run your experiments. So you can actually automate all of this experimental process if you really wanted to. So as I mentioned, we do have the edge stuff. I'm not going to dive into this too deeply right now, but Chi@Edge is going to be a great place if you're doing anything that involves edge or edge to cloud workloads. This is just kind of explaining a little bit more what Chi@Edge is doing. But the most important thing here to note is Chi@Edge is going to be container deployment. So rather than deploying, a virtual machine or a bare metal instance, you're going to be deploying containers on these. We do have IoT like peripherals, so things like cameras, sensors, things like that that you can work with. And then we provide a bring your own device functionality here. So if you have your own Raspberry Pis or you have a Jetson Nano sitting around and you want to add it to the Chameleon system, you can do so through this mechanism. And then your device will show up on the Chiat Edge platform, and you can actually, work with it through Chameleon. So that just a quick overview of some of the features there. Images, we have lots of images that we support for launching instances. Many of the images that we provide are supported by Chameleon. So like these are going to be the prime images that you'll want to use. These are most likely to be up to date, secure, things like that. So that's usually what we recommend. However, if you want to go with your own custom image, you're more than welcome to do that. You can also upload images to use on Chameleon nodes. So you're not restricted at all in any way of using Chameleon supported images. However, it's just usually a good place for most people to start. And then, of course, we also have process for saving your work. So one way to do this is through the snapshot utility. This is basically a way to just snapshot your environment and store it as an image. And then we also have other image tools that you can use to, create the images that you need or package them to share with other people to reuse. So this can be really useful for reproducibility initiatives because essentially you can take the environment you're working with that you've set up for your experiment, you can snapshot that environment, and then you can share that back through Trovy as a public artifact that other people can use. So this is kind of getting into a little bit of that packaging aspect, orchestration, which we do have a lot of examples. So my best advice here is if you're going to do anything that requires a lot of orchestration of Chameleon resources, this may be something like setting up an MPI cluster or doing something more sophisticated that involves, networking or things like that. And you have to set it up across multiple nodes. This is going to be where, examples like this MPI cluster Trovy artifact is going to be useful. So I think there's a lot of good resources to check out if you're going to do something more complex like this. Definitely don't start from scratch. There's a lot of other users who have been down that same path before and probably have shared some stuff out with the rest of the community that can be useful, at least as a starting point. I'm going to skip most of these slides because I think probably it'd be better to jump into some of the actual test beds. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. I can pause for a second right now and just see if there's any questions from any folks in the audience. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's any questions right now. So I'm going to kind of show the basic workflow that I just described in the slides. I'm going to go through, a little bit of each of those components, how to find your resources, how to make reservations, and then how to ultimately configure and launch instances on them. And then I'll try to wrap up briefly by showing off some of the Jupyter and Python Chi interface. So if you're interested in using that, you can get a little bit of a head start there. And then we'll end with some questions, answers, and of course, we'll point folks to helpful resources so that if you run into issues later on, you know where to go to get some help. So here we are on the Chameleon portal. Get here just by going to my web browser, typing in chameleoncloud.org. If this is the first time that you've ever been to the website, you're going to have to log in. This is going to basically walk you through a process to create a Chameleon account. We use federated login through Globus, so creating an account really doesn't mean creating new credentials, or at least it doesn't have to mean that. You can log in through your institution, most likely, through this federated login option. If you don't have an institution that belongs to this Globus operation, you can use Google or OrcID as well as a separate login method. But if I log in through here, this is basically going to take me to my institutional page, and I can log in just using that. So once I'm logged in to the website and I have my account, which, by the way, I should mention, if you're doing this for the first time, you will be asked to agree to our user terms and conditions. So those will be, something to look through, but there's nothing too crazy in there. Mostly just, we don't want people using the test bed for things that are not research. So we prohibit commercial use of the test bed. There's other things in there about following best security practices and avoiding certain reservation behaviors that we prohibit on the platform to ensure that there's enough resources for everyone to go around. But for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward agreement there. Once you've accepted that, you'll have your account, and probably the first place you'll be taken to is going to be the dashboard. So here I just went to my account dropdown. I clicked on this dashboard button here, and this takes me to my user dashboard, which provides a nice overview of basically my projects and tickets on the testbed. Projects are going to be kind of the main organizational unit for Chameleon work on Chameleon. So once you have a user account, and you've been added, or once you have a user account, there is two ways that you can get added to a project. One way is to create a project. So I can go here, click on this create project, and then I would have to fill out some information about the project. However, I should note you can only do this if you have what we call PI eligibility on the testbed. So my account does have PI eligibility. I am therefore able to create projects. These projects still require approval. So even if I create a project right now, it's not just going to show up magically. Someone on the other side on the support staff still has to look at my project and approve it. But that is kind of the main way for people who are PI eligible to get added to projects. In this case, you may just be added to a project rather than applying for PI eligibility before that. In which case, you'll have to be added to the project by the project PI or by a project manager on the project. But essentially, they'll be able to come here, put your email, click add user. We also have an interface for adding multiple users. And then you can also set budgets on the users as well so that certain users don't use up the entire allocation, etc. So the main thing here to realize is that, basically when you're on this dashboard and you want to be able to access Chameleon resources, if you do not see any project under here, that's a red flag. You won't be able to get reserve anything on the testbed. You won't really be able to do anything unless you have a project listed under here that you are a member of. So very important thing to call out at the beginning here. Otherwise, on the dashboard, there's going to be a help desk tab where you can submit new tickets. So this is important if you get stuck with anything on the testbed at any point. You can submit a ticket here for support. But so that's just kind of giving you a quick orientation of the user profile. Once you have your user profile, once you've been added to an active project, then you might be thinking where do I go to actually view the hardware that we have available? So this is where we're going to go from this user tab here to this experiment tab here. This is going to be where all the fun stuff happens. This is where all the good stuff is. First stop on our trip here is going to be the hardware discovery. So when I click on this hardware discovery tab here, I'm going to be taken to this page. And let me give you a little bit of an orientation here. So first thing you're going to see is these availability calendars, which are going to be basically links to calendars that show you when particular types of nodes are available on each site. I'm not going to click on this right now so that because we'll go and check that out a little bit later. When I scroll down a little bit more, there's going to be this thing called the resource browser. And this is going to be probably the most useful thing for finding the hardware that you want to use. So in the very top here, you're going to see just a bunch of green buttons that have node names on them. They're a little bit descriptive. You can see this one says compute. This one has GPU at the very beginning. This one says storage here, etc. These are not going to be the most descriptive things, so I wouldn't necessarily base your entire search off of what these labels are saying here. But if you already know, for instance, like you want a GPU A100, you can just click this button here and click view down here, and it will show you all the nodes that match that type. However, if you don't want to sort by just type and you want to sort by something or filter by something more sophisticated, we provide more granular filters down here. And if you're thinking, well, that's not really that useful either, then we have tons and tons and tons of filters that you can use to search for across all types of different hardware properties. So one thing that might be useful, for instance, is if you need a GPU, you can come down here and click on this GPU true. And then let's say I need like 4 GPUs, then I can click on this GPU count filter. When I scroll back up here, I'll be able to see all the nodes that Chameleon has that meet these criteria. So looks like I have quite a few options. And then I can click on one of these, let's say these Ponte Vecchio nodes. And then to actually view more detail about these, I can click this view button here. And then once I click on that view button, it's going to show me detailed cards about each of these nodes that meet the criteria. And then I can also click onto an individual page and I can see a little bit more information about the hardware node here. And if I really wanted to get this particular node, I could copy this ID here, or I could use this name. And then the next step is going to be actually reserving it. So far right now, all we've done is we've just filtered the nodes that we want to look at. We found some nodes that we're interested in working with. But so far, we don't know anything about the availability of these nodes. So all this is telling me is that these nodes exist. They are on Chameleon. They're available. But it doesn't tell me like I can get these nodes right now, right? Or I could get these nodes tomorrow or whatever. So in order to know that, I need to go and look at what I referred to earlier as the availability calendar. You'll also see this referred to as the host calendar sometimes. But the host calendar is going to be where you can actually see the availability across time for a particular node. And this is great because you can actually use that to then plan your reservation, look for openings for the resource, and then take the openings that you want and make your reservation. So let's go ahead and click on this View Host Calendar button here, and we'll get a little bit better sense of what I'm talking about here. So this is going to take me to a slightly different site. So you'll see here I'm on the chameleoncloud.org domain. Once I click onto that view host calendar, it's actually going to take me to a new domain. This is the chi.tac.chameleon.org domain. And this is an OpenStack site. So this is the Chi Attack site. I am now currently working on the OpenStack site itself. The reason that we talk about sites so much is because it is important to be aware of what site you're on at any particular moment. So because these Ponte Vecchio nodes are only available at Chi Attack, when I clicked on that button back here, it automatically took me to the Chi Attack site, and it loaded up this host calendar with the specific node type that I'm interested in looking at. So if I had clicked on, say, a different node type that was only available at Chi at UC, then I would need to go to this Chi at UC site instead of being on the Chi Attack site, and so on and so forth. Same thing for Chi at in-car, same thing for Chi at Edge, same thing for KVM. So if you want to use a KVM, you have to go to a separate site, OpenStack site. So anyways, now that we're on the site, I can see I'm at Chi Attack. I have this project that I'm using. This is one of 6 active projects I have, so I can use this one, but I could also use one of these other ones, so I can switch back and forth across projects from here. And then finally, let's look at the actual host calendar here. So what this is showing me is that virtually this GPU host is completely free. So there's no reservations on this host right now. There's nobody using this host. There's nobody using it for the next month. So this host is completely available. Now that I see that this host is available, the next question would be, how do I actually reserve it? So I want to use this thing. I know it's available. I can reserve it starting right now if I want to. But how do I actually do that? So this is going to be where we get into reservations. All resources on Chameleon need a reservation. Doesn't matter what it is. Floating IP address. Well, most stuff needs reservations. And we almost always recommend that you reserve all of your resources rather than relying on any ad hoc. But any kind of compute node, any virtual machine, any container, anything that you're going to launch like that requires a reservation before you can do anything. So here I would need to, if I want to launch an instance on this node, I need to reserve this node first before I can do anything else. There's a couple of different ways I can do that. From the host calendar, I can click on this little link here right next to this node, and that will just automatically open up this create lease form for me. What's really cool is that if I do it through here, then it's going to preload this node for me already, so I don't need to like worry about finding this particular node. But let me just show you how you would normally do reservations. So let's say you found this node here, you didn't click on this host calendar button. Instead, you're going to go to Chi Attack here. So again, I said this node is only at Chi Attack, so I need to go to Chi Attack in order to see it. I'm going to click on this button underneath experiment, and this is going to take me back to basically the same place that I was before, right? So I'm here, I'm on this OpenStack site, and instead of being under the reservations tab, right now I'm under this overview tab, which is kind of the default homepage that you'll be taken to whenever you go to a site. And if to get to the leases tab, I'm going to click on the reservations down here, and then I'm going to click leases. And now here I'm going to see all the leases that I've made. This will include leases that are terminated. This includes leases that are pending, as well as leases that are active. So this will be a nice like overview of all the leases that you have associated with your project. Again, on this particular site, none of my reservations or leases at Chi at UC or Chi at NCAR or any other site are going to show up here. This is only for Chi Attack. And then if I want to check the host calendar from here, I can click this, or I can look at networking, the network calendar, because again, you have to reserve network resources, so you want to check the availability. And then finally, there's this create lease button. So as I was doing before, I can give my lease a name. I can specify a start date. If I want the start date to be right now, I just don't do anything here and let it use the default. I can specify the number of days, which you can do up to 7 days for most bare metal leases. For GPUs on VMs or basically any GPUs, it's always going to be 7 day limit to how long you can make a lease for. We do have VMs that you can reserve for longer, like 6 months, but those are just vanilla CPU GPUs or CPU VMs. And then finally, you can also specify an exact time for the lease to end. And then here on this host tab, this is where I'm going to actually specify the hardware. So here it's already giving me a suggestion, but I don't want to reserve that type. So I'm going to put in Ponte Vecchio nodes, and then that's going to show up down here. I can click on this. So this filter is basically what allows me to select a specific kind of resource that I want. And then if I wanted to reserve more than one, I could do so by changing this minimum and maximum number up here, but I'm just going to stick with one. And then here, if I wanted to reserve networking resources, I could do that here. I'm not going to do that for this one, but I am going to reserve a floating IP address. This is going to be what we attach to the node to actually provide some kind of public connection to it so that I can SSH into the instance after I've launched it and actually work with it. And when I click create on this, it's going to submit my lease as I've specified it in the form to the system. And then basically I'm going to wait for it to pop up with some kind of message here, either an error message or a success. So here we got a success. And now I can see in my list of leases down here, the lease is pending. Because I set it to launch right away, it's going to immediately start going into the active state. So if I refresh this page, still going to be pending, but after a little bit of time, this should turn to active. And now we can see the lease is active. So now this lease is actually running. I have the node reserved. It is mine to use right now until tomorrow. So I have 24 hours. I have access to this node. And now I can actually go about launching an instance on it. So if I go to the compute tab here and I click instance, then I can go and start setting up my instance. I'm going to click this launch instance button here. It's going to pre-fill my project name. I have to give my instance a name, so I'll just put test here. If I wanted to put a description, something a little bit more rich, I could add that there. Very important step now, I need to select my reservation. So I need to make sure I select the correct reservation for the Ponte Vecchios that I reserved. And then I'm going to tell it how many instances I want. In this case, I'm just going to launch one. The next step would be adding a image to use for the source. I'm actually not sure what images are compatible with Ponte Vecchio, but let's just say for the sake of the demo that I'm using Ubuntu 24, I can assign that image to this instance by clicking this up button here, or if I want to take it back, I can click the down button. But once it's up here, it says it's allocated, so that's the source that I would be using. And then down here, I can add a network. So the default network to add usually is shared net 1. This will be basically the way for you to connect your instance to the public internet so that you can connect to SSH to it. And then last important step is I'm going to want to add an SSH key. If you're not familiar with SSH, basically this is a way to securely connect to a remote instance. So in this case, I'm going to launch this instance, but it's going to be launched on, Chameleon's hardware, not my hardware. So I'm going to have to connect to it remotely. The best way to do this usually is through SSH. And to do that, you'll need to add a key pair in order to have that available. So here I'm going to add my key pair. one thing to note here is you can import key pairs or you can also create them on the platform here. And then I'll just quickly show, we do have some more advanced options. Flavor is not really relevant for bare metal because it's always going to be bare metal as the flavor. But if you're doing a virtual machine, this step is going to be important because you'll need to tell the system specifically what kind of flavor virtual machine you want to use. Network ports is also something I can configure here. So if I have, specific configuration for network ports that I need, that's a good place to put that stuff. And then there's also more advanced things you can do for configuration and for scheduling hints. So I'm not going to launch this right now because, as I said, I don't know if this actually would work, and it takes about 15 to 20 minutes for a launch instance to actually boot up, especially a bare metal instance. So we're not going to just sit here and wait for that to launch. But once I click this button, it would essentially launch the instance, and we would see it show up here. It would have a state, would be able to tell me, kind of what's happening and et cetera. So I could see that booting up as it's happening. And then once it's running, the thing that you'll need to do is attach your floating IP address. So that's like something that you can do through these action buttons on the side here. You can also go to the network tab, click on floating IPs. And then here, if you have a free IP, you can click associate. And from here, you'll be able to select the IP address and then select the specific port for your instance that you want to associate it with. And once you've done that, you have your instance launched, it's running, you have your IP address associated with the instance. Then at that point, that's where you would be able to open up a terminal. And from the terminal, you could SSH to your instance using your identity file and specifying CC at whatever the specific floating IP address is that you associate with your node. So if I were to SSH right now into this node, I would say, SSH, give my identity file, and then use the CC username and the floating IP. This takes me to my instance, and then I'm basically working in the instance as if it were mine. I can do whatever I want. I have pseudo privileges, all of that good stuff. So that's kind of the basic workthrough of, going to Chameleon through the graphic user interface, setting up a lease, launching the lease, configuring it, and then actually connecting to it through SSH.
Yeah,
There are other things to explore through here, including containers. As I mentioned, there's some more sophisticated orchestration things that you can use through the OpenStack interface. And there's also a shared file system that you can set up as well. Sorry, Mark, did you have something to add?
Um, yeah, you just mentioned containers. I want to mention that those mean object store buckets like S3 buckets for our bare metal sites, but we do have a edge device container service on Chiat Edge if you're interested in containers. There is a question about what does flavor mean for VMs? Do I could handle that. So Mark mentioned earlier, there's node types which are kind of groupings of similar hardware. Like when we install new hardware to the test bed, we get a set of nodes that are all pretty much the same. That's a node type. When on the virtualized site, we don't have like all the hardware is grouped together for VMs, and instead you request the shape of the VM that you want. So that might mean four vCPUs, 4 GB of RAM, and that's the flavor of, and I think that flavor would be called like medium, or large in our system. We also have some flavors that have CPU and RAM plus an H100 GPU. So I think if you go to reservations, Mark, and create one, there is a table that kind of compares all of our flavors. So I think you'll want to do launch lease to see. Uh, yeah. So on Chameleon, the flavors we have right now are these M1 dot something. So those are all the relative size of the VM. So yeah, M1 large is 4 vCPUs, 8 gigabytes of memory. But Mark's also pointing out we have these G1.H100 flavors, and those all come with various forms of an H100 GPU.
Okay.
So there's the dot one and the dot four, which have one H100 and four H100s respectively.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. One more follow-up question with regards to the VMs. Um, is it expected that the VM support would be specifically targeting x86, or do you have support for ARM for the virtual machines?
At the moment, we only have x86 VMs. Um, that's an interesting request. I don't know if I've seen. I'll keep that in mind if that's something that's of interest. But at the
Uh,
moment we just have x86 hypervisors.
okay. Yeah, I was not necessarily requesting it. I was just curious
Okay.
what was the limitation there.
Yeah,
Also,
they all are uh older x86 nodes that we've moved over into hypervisors. That
okay,
so
perfect. Another question before I mute myself. As you were SSHing to the system, you use CC as the user ID. Is that what we would expect to do? Just generically use a CC user ID, or would we have our own user IDs? And if so, where would we find that?
Yeah, so I think, well, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but the default, pretty much anytime you launch an instance on Chameleon, it sets up that CC user, and that's pretty much what you'll use to SSH into every single instance.
Okay, and that user, when you get there, is that user set up to have sudo privilege, or is that user root when it gets there?
Mark, is it? I think it's root, right?
you do have sudo access.
Yeah.
So
Uh
we'd have to, if we were to
um,
like want to install a package, we'd have to sudo install the package rather than just invoking privilege commands
yes.
directly, right?
Yeah, so the you have to so this is how it works in our custom images. We have CC set up and you can sudo into root. Um and I would recommend that. I mean, you could set up SSH access to root directly, but just for a little bit more security, we don't have that by default.
Okay,
But you do have, full root access to your instance to do whatever you need with.
perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Are there any other questions from anybody in the audience? As I mentioned, if you have a question, feel free to use the raise hand function, and I'll unmute you to ask your question.
So I
Uh,
have a question. So when, right now this is kind of abstract. Maybe we have users who have experience with Chameleon. Maybe we have users who have no experience, but right now it's kind of hard for us to understand how we're going to use the tool without already having an assignment before us. When we get into using Chameleon and getting our allocation and going through the process of setting up nodes and reservations, if we have trouble, is there a support mechanism we can use to inquire specifics through your team?
yeah, so we have this Learn tab here is going to be quite useful. This is going to link to our FAQs, which has mostly general kind of policy type information about, what's allowed, best practices, tips and tricks, things like that. So that's a good place just to get kind of familiar with some of the policies on the testbed. We also have our documentation, technical documentation. So this is going to have, basically all the kind of overview of all the different things that we offer on the platform, on the system. It's going to also provide kind of a nice getting started guide, which is what I basically went through today. I think other thing I should mention is we do have this AI Docs Assistant, which is a preview right now, so I wouldn't necessarily rely on it too much, but this can be useful for, chatting with the documentation to some extent. And then the other thing is we have the help desk. So this is going to be the best resource for getting, individual attention on a specific issue. The help desk, you can just create a new ticket whenever you need to, assuming you have a user account. Well, actually, I think you can submit one without a user account too. But if you have a user account, it will, pre-populate everything for you, and then you can just describe what you're facing. And we have this help desk staffed, during business hours. So we, try to respond to these issues pretty quickly. The other thing I'll mention as a good resource, if you're getting stuck, is tips and tricks. So this can be worth browsing through because, we have things like what's more useful to use in particular situations, bare metal or virtual machines, and what's the difference between those different resources. And a lot of times these tips and tricks blogs will link out to other useful resources. So these can be good places to look for specific issues. And then kind of getting into where I was going, we also have these Chameleon supported artifacts in Trovy. So if you didn't see how I got here, I just went from experiment tab here down to Trovy here. And this is, I think, probably one of the most useful places to go for resources, because if you click on these Chameleon supported artifacts here, you're going to see some like actual tutorials in here. There's also going to be a lot of like images and stuff that you'll see. These are all like the supported images and things that I mentioned earlier. But again, there's going to be a lot of like experimental patterns, like tutorials, things that you can look through and get a better sense of like what you can do with the system. So for instance, this bare metal experiment pattern is a pretty useful one. And if I click on the artifact itself, I'll see like a description of the artifact. There's some stats that you can see associated with this. This is nice if, for instance, you package your own experiments and you upload it to Trovy. You can actually track, how many people are looking at it, how many people are running it, so on and so forth. But if you're just looking at, an artifact that you found on here and you want to launch it onto Chameleon, you can click this launch button here. And this is going to open up our Jupyter Hub interface. So this is going to be basically like working in Jupyter Hub, except you're in the Chameleon environment itself. So you have all of your authentication already set up, the credentials, etc. So this can be, basically, this is like the best place to work with Python Chi, because you can program things like, reserve this node, take this script that I have in this folder here and upload it to the node, and then run that, and then return the data back to me here. And then you can plot all of that in the notebook itself. So it really is a nice way to kind of fully integrate the experimental workflow. This takes a pretty long time to boot up, but once it boots up, you'll see there's a really nice starting point for, exploring Chameleon or even starting your own package artifact for the conference. So, okay, now this is loaded. So here, I launched this on Chameleon. Now I can see this here in the Jupyter interface. If I click into this folder here, I'm going to be able to open up this experiment notebook. And here, this is going to show you kind of basically everything that we just did through the GUI interface, except doing this all through through the Python Chi library. So here, this is like the initial steps of configuring like which site you're going to use, selecting the project that you're going to use. Here we can use this hardware module and specify a node type and look for availability across nodes. So this is really useful for finding kind of free time slots. We can create leases here, launch our servers, configure the networking, and then download our GitHub repository and actually run our experiment scripts. And then once we get that experiment scripts, we can actually take the data back out and download it to our local environment and then plot that data in the new notebook itself. So this is, I think, a really good place for people to get started if you're just like overwhelmed by all the things that you're seeing today and you just need some like simple, straightforward example of how does this work. This is a really great resource to use. Let me just drop this in the chat real quick. But yeah, this I think, and I should also say, don't necessarily limit yourself only to Chameleon supported artifacts, because a lot of the artifacts on here are uploaded by other users, and there's just an incredibly rich repository of artifacts on here. So definitely worth, spending maybe half an hour just browsing through it, see if you notice anything that maybe looks like it could be a good starting point or a reference for you. Usually these can be great places to get ideas and get a better sense of how you can start working with the platform yourself. So that I think takes us up to about time. I know we started a bit late, so I'm more than happy to stay on for a little longer and answer any other questions that might come up. Jennifer, is there anything else that you would like to go over?
I think this is a really good introduction. I think, we had a kind of a small set of people who attended. We did have some repeat reviewers from last year, so I think there were some people who were already familiar with the platform. We will have our assignments sent out to our reviewer committee come like the second week of July. So
Okay.
that's probably when we're gonna, probably have a lot of questions. One thing I was wondering is there, we can certainly field questions, and we're going to have a touch point in our Slack channel. And then we're also going to have kind of office hours. I have my camera on, but I have my thing. We have office hours that are scheduled every Wednesday for the duration of the time that we're going to be reviewing artifacts. Would it be possible for us to maybe get somebody from Chameleon to be present occasionally in those office hours, or available to answer questions if we have somebody who's stuck on using Chameleon during that time?
Yeah.
Is that something that would be out, you guys would be able to support?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we can definitely come to those office hours. Another thing we could also do is we have a Chameleon user Slack, so we could also set up like a Slack
Oh,
channel in
that
that
would be even
and
better, I think. Yeah.
invite the authors. One thing I should say though is we're a little wary of doing that because we have support staff, but they have to be supporting everyone at the same time. So the only thing I'd caveat with like the Slack thing is like we may not be able to like respond to everything immediately, but at least it would be a kind of a more direct channel for people to ask questions. And the nice thing about that too is if everyone's working with Chameleon, then other users might jump in and answer some questions from other users and things like that. So
Mhm.
so yeah, we can
And
definitely do that if you think it would be helpful.
yeah, I mean, this is going to be a target for the reviewers, not the authors. So I think that that's going to be
Okay.
less people. Um, yeah, let's maybe offline, let's make a decision on that and we'll communicate it out to the reviewer committee. But yeah, I think this is fantastic. Does anyone have any questions or anything before we conclude?
No
I think
question.
we've had
Just
some
wanted
people.
to thank the Chameleon team for providing this tutorial
Yeah.
and help our new reviewers kind of navigate this space. Really appreciate it.
Of course. And if there's any other questions, please feel free to reach out through the help desk. I can share these slides as well if you'd like to share them out.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. And this is also reviewed or being recorded. So we do have kind of an international reviewer committee. So this is not ideal for everybody. So if we can have a link to that whenever it's published, then we can point those who weren't able to make the presentation. We can point them to the recorded demo. But thank you very much. This is fantastic. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for everyone for attending, and good luck with your experiments.
All right. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Take care.